There's something happening to millions of people right now that Carl Jung predicted decades ago. A profound inner awakening that creates experiences so intense, so transformative, that most people can't even put them into words. These aren't your typical spiritual platitudes or feel-good affirmations. These are deep, often disturbing psychological shifts that mark the beginning of what Jung called individuation. The process of becoming who you truly are beneath all the masks and conditioning. If you've been feeling like reality itself is shifting around you, like you're seeing through veils that once seemed solid, like parts of yourself are dying while others are being born, Jung would say you're not losing your mind, you're finding your soul. And with that discovery comes experiences that only those walking this path can truly understand. Today we're exploring 7 profound inner experiences that Jung observed in spiritually awakening individuals. These aren't symptoms to cure or problems to solve. They're markers of consciousness expanding beyond its previous limitations. And according to Jung, recognizing these experiences for what they are isn't just helpful, it's essential for navigating this transformation without losing yourself in the process. But here's Jung's warning. Most people who experience these profound shifts don't understand what's happening to them. They pathologize what should be celebrated. They resist what needs to be integrated. They fear what could liberate them, because our culture has no framework for understanding spiritual awakening as a psychological process. Jung spent his entire career documenting these experiences, not as mystical curiosities, but as predictable stages in human psychological development. The same way a caterpillar must dissolve into formless soup before becoming a butterfly, human consciousness must undergo its own dissolution and reformation. The experiences we're about to explore are the markers of that metamorphosis. The first experience that spiritually awakening people feel deep inside is perhaps the most unsettling. The sudden, unavoidable encounter with their own psychological shadow. Jung discovered that true spiritual development doesn't begin with light and love. It begins with darkness and truth. The shadow represents everything about yourself that you've rejected, denied, or hidden throughout your life. Not just the obviously negative traits, but also positive qualities you've disowned because they didn't fit your self-image or social expectations. This encounter typically begins as projection. You'll find yourself intensely triggered by certain people, disgusted by behaviors you see in others, or righteously angry about injustices in the world. But then something shifts. Jung observed that spiritually awakening individuals begin to recognize these external triggers as mirrors reflecting their own internal landscape. The woman who judges others for being selfish suddenly recognizes her own capacity for selfishness that she's spent years denying. The man who despises manipulative people realizes he's been manipulating others through guilt and emotional blackmail. The person who condemns greed sees their own hoarding tendencies and desperate need for security. This recognition isn't intellectual. It's visceral, emotional, often accompanied by shame, horror, or profound disillusionment with your previous self-image. But Jung discovered something crucial about shadow work. The shadow isn't just a repository of negative traits. It's also where your disowned power, creativity, and authenticity reside. The person who spent their life being nice and agreeable discovers their capacity for healthy anger and boundary setting. The individual who's prided themselves on being rational finds their intuitive wisdom. The one who's maintained perfect control encounters their wild, spontaneous nature. Jung experienced this directly during his own psychological crisis. He wrote in his Red Book about encountering aspects of himself that terrified him, voices and images that challenged everything he thought he knew about his own character. But rather than running from these encounters, he engaged with them, recognizing them as essential parts of his complete personality, seeking integration. The shadow work process is ongoing and often cyclical. Just when you think you've integrated a particular aspect, life presents you with a deeper layer. Each integration expands your capacity for self-acceptance and authentic expression. You become less judgmental of others because you've made peace with those same qualities within yourself. You develop what Jung called psychological maturity, the ability to hold paradox and contradiction without needing to resolve them into simple categories. The second profound experience Jung identified is the complete dissolution of familiar motivation and drive. After significant spiritual breakthroughs or realizations, many awakening individuals experience what feels like motivational collapse. The ambitions that once drove their lives suddenly feel hollow. The goals that seemed important lose their appeal. The external validations they once sought become meaningless. This experience can be profoundly disorienting because it often follows periods of intense spiritual growth or insight. You might expect to feel more motivated, more purposeful, more driven toward meaningful action. Instead, you feel empty, directionless, sometimes completely apathetic about things that used to matter deeply. Jung understood this as a necessary death of ego-driven motivation, making space for something more authentic to emerge. The ego, which Jung saw as the conscious personality we present to the world, operates primarily through desire, fear, and comparison. It wants to achieve, accumulate, impress, and avoid pain or failure. But spiritual awakening transcends these ego motivations, leaving the individual temporarily without a compass for action. The old motivations feel false, but the new ones haven't yet crystallized. Jung observed that this motivational void often triggers panic in awakening individuals. They interpret the absence of familiar drive as depression, spiritual crisis, or evidence that their awakening was somehow fake or temporary. They try to force themselves back into old patterns of ambition and goal setting, only to find that these approaches but feel increasingly hollow and exhausted. Jung recognized this phase as essential preparation for authentic engagement with life. The ego's motivations, while necessary for basic functioning, are ultimately limited and often destructive. They lead to endless cycles of striving, achieving satisfaction, and renewed temporary striving. The dissolution of these patterns creates space for what Jung called self-actualization, motivation that arises not from lacking something but from expressing your essential nature. This new form of motivation doesn't feel like being driven or pushed toward goals. Instead, it feels like being drawn or attracted toward activities and expressions that align with your deepest values and authentic self. Actions begin flowing from a sense of rightness rather than obligation. You find yourself naturally gravitating toward work, relationships, and creative expressions that feel genuinely meaningful rather than socially acceptable or financially rewarding. The transition period can last months or even years, and Jung emphasized that trying to rush through it or force artificial motivation only prolongs the process. The key is learning to trust the wisdom of this motivational emptiness, using it as an opportunity to discover what truly matters when all external pressures are removed. The third experience that marks spiritual awakening is the phenomenon Jung called synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences that seem to bridge inner psychological states with outer events begin occurring with increasing frequency and intensity. These aren't random coincidences that you're reading meaning into. They're precisely timed events that carry emotional significance and often provide guidance or confirmation for your inner development. Jung first recognized synchronicity through his clinical work when a highly rational patient was describing a dream about a golden scarab beetle. At that exact moment, a scarab beetle began tapping on his office window, an insect rarely seen in that geographic location. This perfectly timed event shattered the patient's rigid rational worldview and opened her to psychological healing that had been previously impossible. For spiritually awakening individuals, synchronicities become a regular feature of daily life. You might think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, only to receive their phone call that same day. A book falls off a shelf at exactly the moment you're struggling with the very issue it addresses. You repeatedly encounter the same numbers, symbols, or phrases during periods of significant life transitions. Strangers appear with exactly the message or assistance you need at precisely the right moment. Jung understood these experiences as evidence that consciousness and matter are more interconnected than our rational minds typically acknowledge. During periods of spiritual awakening, the boundaries between inner and outer reality become more permeable. Your heightened awareness and expanded consciousness create conditions where these meaningful connections become visible and experientially real. But synchronicities aren't just cosmic winks or proof of spiritual advancement. Jung saw them as communications from the unconscious, guidance from the deeper wisdom that emerges during individuation. They often occur during periods of uncertainty or transition, providing direction when your rational mind doesn't know how to proceed. They confirm that you're aligned with your authentic path or signal when you've strayed from it. The fourth profound experience that Jung documented in spiritually awakening individuals is the sudden, overwhelming connection to what he called the collective unconscious. This isn't an intellectual understanding of shared human experience. It's a visceral recognition that your individual consciousness is part of a vast, interconnected web of awareness that spans all of humanity across time and culture. This connection typically manifests as sudden insights into universal symbols, mythological patterns, or archetypal energies that you've never formally studied. You might find yourself deeply moved by ancient symbols from cultures you know nothing about. Dreams begin featuring imagery from mythology you've never encountered. You feel inexplicably drawn to certain spiritual traditions or wisdom teachings that seem to speak directly to your soul despite having no previous exposure to them. Jung experienced this directly during his exploration of alchemical texts. Despite having no background in alchemy, he found the symbolic language immediately comprehensible, recognizing in these medieval writings the same psychological processes he was observing in his patients and experiencing in his own individuation journey. The symbols weren't foreign, they were familiar, as if he was remembering rather than learning. For awakening individuals, this connection to collective wisdom can be both exhilarating and overwhelming. You might suddenly understand why certain myths persist across cultures, why specific symbols appear in art and religion throughout human history, why particular stories resonate so deeply across time and geography. You're not just accessing information, you're tapping into the shared psychological heritage of humanity itself. This experience often comes with a sense of profound responsibility. You realize you're not just healing your individual wounds or pursuing your personal growth. You're participating in the collective healing and evolution of human consciousness. Your individual journey of integration and awakening contributes to the larger movement of consciousness becoming aware of itself through human experience. Jung observed that people often struggle with this expanded sense of connection and responsibility. The ego, accustomed to thinking of itself as separate and independent, can feel overwhelmed by the recognition of such profound interconnection. Some retreat into isolation, feeling too sensitive to engage with a world they now experience as intimately connected to their own psyche. Others become inflated, convinced they've been chosen for some special mission to save or enlighten humanity. The healthy integration of this collective connection requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between your individual nature and your connection to the universal. You learn to honor both your personal journey and your participation in something infinitely larger without losing yourself in either extreme. The fifth experience that marks spiritual awakening is the dissolution of conventional moral categories and the emergence of a more sophisticated ethical framework. This isn't moral relativism or the abandonment of values. It's the recognition that reality operates through paradox and contradiction in ways that simple good, bad, right, wrong categories cannot capture. Jung discovered that spiritually awakening individuals begin to see beyond dualistic thinking. They recognize their own capacity for both creation and destruction, love and hatred, wisdom and foolishness, often simultaneously. This recognition doesn't lead to paralysis or cynicism. Instead, it creates what Jung called moral sophistication, the ability to engage ethically with complexity rather than hiding behind the false security of absolute rules. This shift typically begins with recognizing the shadow projections in your previous moral certainties. The qualities you most despised in others reveal themselves as disowned aspects of your own nature. The behaviors you judged most harshly in the world become recognizable as potentials within your own psyche. This doesn't excuse harmful actions or eliminate the need for ethical boundaries. It creates a more nuanced understanding that includes rather than excludes the full spectrum of human possibility. You might find yourself developing compassion for people you previously wrote off as irredeemable. Understanding the psychological wounds that drive destructive behavior doesn't excuse the behavior. but it does expand your capacity for seeing the wounded humanity behind the actions. You begin responding to situations from wisdom rather than reactivity, from understanding rather than judgment. Jung experienced this moral evolution during his own confrontation with the unconscious. He encountered aspects of his psyche that challenged his comfortable Swiss psychiatrist identity. Rather than rejecting these darker elements, he learned to engage with them consciously, recognizing them as sources of energy and insight when integrated rather than repressed. This expanded moral framework often creates temporary disorientation. Your old ethical compass based on external rules and social expectations no longer provides clear direction. You're developing an internal ethical sense based on authentic relationship with yourself and life. But this new compass takes time to calibrate. You might find yourself questioning beliefs and values that once seemed unshakable. Not because they're necessarily wrong, but because they're incomplete. The sixth profound experience Jung identified is the emergence of what he called transpersonal awareness. This is the recognition that your individual consciousness participates in a larger intelligence or cosmic consciousness that permeates all existence. This isn't a belief or philosophy. It's a direct experiential knowing that fundamentally alters your understanding of identity and reality. This transpersonal recognition typically begins with moments where the boundaries of personal identity become permeable or dissolve entirely. You might experience states where the distinction between self and other, self and nature, or self and universe becomes meaningless. These aren't necessarily dramatic mystical experiences. They can be subtle shifts in perception where you recognize consciousness as the fundamental fabric of reality, rather than something you possess as an individual. During these expansions of awareness, many people report feeling simultaneously intensely personal and completely universal. You remain yourself while recognizing that selfhood extends far beyond your personal history, roles, or individual personality. It's as if you discover that what you thought was a separate wave realizes it's actually the entire ocean expressing itself as this particular waveform. Jung understood this transpersonal dimension as essential to complete psychological development. The ego's sense of separation, while necessary for functioning in the world, is ultimately an illusion that creates suffering when taken as absolute truth. The recognition of consciousness as fundamental reality doesn't eliminate individual identity. Instead, it contextualizes it within a much larger framework of being. This expanded awareness often brings profound shifts in how you relate to death, suffering, and the apparent meaninglessness that can plague human existence. When you recognize your essential nature as consciousness itself, physical death becomes a transformation rather than an ending. Personal suffering becomes part of a larger process of awakening rather than meaningless pain. Life's apparent randomness reveals itself as part of an intelligent unfolding that transcends your individual perspective. But Jung warned against premature transcendence or spiritual bypassing. The transpersonal dimension isn't an escape from human experience. It's the context that gives human experience its deepest meaning. You don't transcend your humanity. You finally embrace it fully, recognizing your individual journey as consciousness knowing itself through this particular form and set of circumstances. The integration of transpersonal awareness requires what Jung called living the paradox. You simultaneously know yourself as limited and unlimited, temporary and eternal, individual and universal. This isn't a contradiction to resolve, but a mystery to embody, allowing you to engage fully with human life while maintaining perspective on its deeper significance. The seventh and final experience Jung identified as marking spiritual awakening is perhaps the most paradoxical. The simultaneous deepening of solitude and connection that emerges as consciousness expands beyond conventional boundaries. This isn't the loneliness of isolation or the superficial connection of social networking. It's what Jung called conscious solitude paired with authentic intimacy, a profound shift in how you relate to both yourself and others. As spiritual awakening progresses, many individuals find themselves naturally withdrawing from relationships and activities that once felt normal or enjoyable. Social gatherings that used to energize you now feel draining. Conversations that once seemed meaningful now feel hollow. Relationships based on shared complaints, gossip, or surface-level interactions become impossible to maintain. You're not becoming antisocial, you're becoming selectively social, drawn only to connections that honor the depth you've discovered within yourself. This selective withdrawal often creates confusion and sometimes guilt. Friends and family members might interpret your new boundaries as rejection or judgment. You might worry that you're becoming isolated or superior. But Jung understood this phase as essential psychological hygiene. Your consciousness has expanded, and maintaining it requires protecting yourself from influences that would pull you back into unconscious patterns. The solitude that emerges isn't empty loneliness. It's rich, creative space where your authentic self can fully emerge without the pressure to conform to others' expectations or unconscious projections. You discover that you genuinely enjoy your own company in ways you never experienced before. Silence becomes nourishing rather than uncomfortable. Time alone becomes productive and restorative rather than something to fill with distractions. But parallel to this deepening capacity for solitude comes an enhanced ability for genuine intimacy. When you do connect with others, the quality of connection transforms dramatically. You're no longer relating from persona to persona, playing social roles and maintaining acceptable images. You're meeting from authenticity to authenticity, recognizing the deeper self in both yourself and others. Jung observed that spiritually awakening individuals develop what he called conscious relationship, the ability to see beyond someone's personality, behavior, or social presentation to the essential being underneath. This doesn't mean ignoring harmful behavior or maintaining unhealthy relationships. It means responding to the core person rather than reacting to their unconscious patterns or projections. These conscious connections often feel rare and precious when they occur. You might find that you can count on one hand the people with whom you can be completely authentic. But those relationships become profound sources of mutual growth and support. You're no longer seeking someone to complete you or validate your existence. You're sharing the fullness of who you are with someone else doing the same. This shift in relationship patterns often requires grieving the loss of connections that can't adapt to your expanded awareness. Friendships that were based on shared unconsciousness naturally dissolve. Family relationships might become strained as you stop playing familiar roles or enabling dysfunctional patterns. Romantic partnerships that were built on mutual projection and neediness either transform or end. Jung experienced this relationship transformation during his own individuation process. His marriage to Emma underwent profound changes as both partners grew and evolved. Some friendships deepened while others faded. His professional relationships shifted as he developed his own theoretical framework rather than following established psychological schools. He learned to value quality over quantity in all his connections. The integration of conscious solitude and authentic intimacy creates what Jung called psychological maturity. You become comfortable with your own depths while remaining available for genuine meeting with others. You no longer seek relationships to escape yourself or to prove your worth. You engage with others from overflow rather than neediness, offering your gifts while honoring your boundaries. This mature approach to relationship often confuses people still operating from unconscious patterns. They might interpret your self-sufficiency as coldness or your boundaries as rejection. They might feel threatened by your refusal to participate in familiar dramas or enable their unconscious behavior. Learning to maintain your center while compassionately witnessing others' reactions becomes an ongoing practice. Jung recognized that these 7 experiences don't occur in linear sequence or happen only once. Spiritual awakening is a spiral process where you revisit each of these territories at deeper levels throughout your life. The shadow work continues to reveal new layers. Motivational shifts occur with each expansion of consciousness. Synchronicities provide ongoing guidance as you navigate life's complexities. Your connection to collective wisdom deepens with experience. Moral sophistication develops through facing increasingly complex ethical situations. Transpersonal awareness stabilizes through repeated recognition and integration. Relationship patterns continue evolving as you grow and attract others who match your level of consciousness. What makes these experiences particularly challenging in our culture is the lack of framework for understanding them as normal developmental processes. Most people encountering these shifts assume something is wrong with them. They seek therapy to fix their motivational changes, medication to stop their sensitivity to others' unconscious material, or spiritual practices to escape the intensity of their awakening rather than integrate it. Jung's greatest contribution was recognizing these experiences as markers of psychological health rather than pathology. The person who can no longer tolerate unconscious relationships isn't antisocial. They've developed authentic relationship capacity. The individual who loses motivation for ego-driven achievements isn't depressed. They're transitioning to self-actualized engagement with life. The one who becomes sensitive to synchronicity isn't delusional. They're recognizing the interconnected nature of reality. But Jung also warned against the dangers of spiritual inflation that can accompany these experiences. The ego can co-opt awakening experiences, using them to create a new identity as someone special or enlightened. This inflation is just as problematic as unconsciousness, creating spiritual superiority and disconnection from ordinary human experience. The healthy integration of awakening experiences requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between expanded awareness and grounded humanity. You honor the profound shifts occurring within you while maintaining your capacity to function effectively in the world. You recognize the significance of your experiences without using them to separate yourself from others who haven't had similar experiences. This integration process often takes years or even decades. Each experience must be fully felt, understood, and incorporated into your daily life. The insights must be translated into practical wisdom. The expanded awareness must be grounded in concrete action. The spiritual openings must be balanced with psychological stability. Jung himself spent years integrating the experiences documented in his Red Book. He didn't rush to publish his encounters with the unconscious or immediately change his professional life. He allowed the experiences to settle, to reveal their meaning gradually, to transform him from within before expressing them outwardly. This patient integration allowed his insights to emerge as mature psychological theory rather than personal spiritual experience. The ultimate purpose of these 7 experiences, according to Jung, isn't to make you different from other people or to elevate you above ordinary existence. It's to make you more fully human, more authentic in your self-expression, more conscious in your choices, more present in your relationships, more aligned with your essential nature while remaining engaged with life's practical demands. As Jung observed throughout his career, the goal of individuation isn't perfection or transcendence of human limitations. It's the conscious embrace of your complete humanity, including both light and shadow, individual and universal aspects, personal needs and transpersonal awareness. The spiritually awakening person doesn't become superhuman, they become genuinely human for the first time. These experiences mark not the end of your human journey, but its true beginning. When you stop living unconsciously, driven by patterns you don't understand, you can finally start living consciously, making choices that align with your deepest truth. When you integrate your shadow instead of projecting it onto others, you can engage with life's complexity without losing your center. When you recognize your connection to the collective unconscious, you can access wisdom that transcends your personal experience while honoring your individual perspective. The path Jung mapped through these 7 experiences isn't easy or comfortable. It requires courage to face aspects of yourself you've spent years avoiding. It demands patience during periods of confusion and disorientation. It asks for faith when familiar structures dissolve and new ones haven't yet formed. But for those called to this journey of conscious awakening, these challenges become opportunities for growth that no external achievement could provide. Jung believed that our collective future depends on individuals willing to undertake this inner work. A world of unconscious people projecting their shadows onto each other creates endless conflict and suffering. But individuals who have integrated their shadow, developed authentic relationships, and recognized their connection to something larger than themselves become sources of healing and wisdom in the world. They don't necessarily become teachers or healers professionally, but their very presence carries a quality of consciousness that others can sense and be influenced by. If you've recognized yourself in these 7 experiences, Jung would want you to know something crucial. You're not broken, abnormal, or losing your mind. You're undergoing the most important transformation a human being can experience. The dissolution of who you thought you were to make space for who you actually are. This isn't a spiritual emergency, it's spiritual emergence. But here's what Jung discovered through decades of clinical work. The people who navigate this transformation successfully are those who understand what's happening to them. They don't pathologize their shadow encounters or try to force their old motivations back to life. They don't dismiss their synchronicities or resist their expanding awareness. They work with these experiences consciously, recognizing them as essential stages in becoming whole. The 7 experiences we've explored aren't destinations. They're ongoing processes that deepen throughout your lifetime. Each time you think you've integrated your shadow completely, life reveals another layer. Every period of motivational emptiness prepares you for more authentic engagement. Each synchronicity guides you toward greater alignment with your true path. Jung's warning remains as relevant today as it was decades ago. Our culture still has no framework for understanding these experiences as normal psychological development. Most people will try to medicate them away, therapy them into submission, or spiritual bypass them into transcendence. But you now have the map Jung created through his own journey and the thousands of individuals he guided through theirs. Your awakening isn't just personal transformation. It's your contribution to the evolution of human consciousness itself. Every shadow you integrate, every authentic relationship you create, every moment of transpersonal awareness you embody ripples out into the collective field of human experience. You're not just healing yourself, you're participating in the healing of our species. The journey ahead won't be easy, but Jung would remind you that nothing worth doing ever is. You're becoming conscious in a world that rewards unconsciousness. You're seeking authenticity in a culture that celebrates performance. You're choosing depth in a society obsessed with surface. But this is exactly why your awakening matters so profoundly. Welcome to the real work of being human.